Welcome to Kendal Mountain Book Festival, presented as part of Kendal Mountain Festival. We are delighted that this session has been sponsored by the University of Cumbria to help us talk about 12 words for moss. My name's Imi Sykes. I am a runner, a cyclist, a climber, general outdoor enthusiast. And I'm really, really excited to be with you this afternoon talking to Elizabeth-Jane Burnett. As you probably know, or maybe you don't, I don't know, Elizabeth-Jane Burnett is a poet and academic whose work explores environmental issues through creative writing. 12 Words for Moss blends poetry, prose, and memoir and explores the mosses of places across the UK, helping her overcome the grief following her father's death. I do want to just caveat this session. I'm coming off the back of a chest infection and have done 3 sessions already, so I will try my best to not cough and splutter, but if I do, I'm really sorry. And I think also Elizabeth-Jane is also struggling. I think it's that season. The structure for this session is kind of a 45-minute chat. There will be readings interspersed into this because it's poetry and you can't not have readings of poetry. We'll do a Q&A for sort of about 10-15 minutes at the end, so please start thinking about your questions. That is always my favourite part of every session, and then we will have a book signing at the back. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Elizabeth-Jane, welcome.
Thank you.
I guess one of my first questions for you has to be, why moss? Why now? Where did this come from?
Yeah, well, I'm seeing a lot of mossy colours around the room, so this will perhaps lead into an answer to that. All the kind of oranges and reds, and there's not too many greens, but we've got all that russet autumn colour really beautifully setting up this talk, I think, today. So well done, audience, just to start with. I've let the side down myself. But yeah, I think so. The colour is one way into mosses. I think if you're not familiar with mosses or haven't stopped to think about them that much, you think green. But, you know, there are shades of green, there are reds, there are oranges, purples, yellows, russets, pinks, peaches, really colourful spectrum where you don't expect to find them. So we expect that in the flower world. Mosses don't flower. They are very simple structures, very simple beings on the floor, on the ground beneath our feet. And yet, when you do pause and just take a moment, you see all these colours, textures, shapes. And for me, I suppose, although I've always loved moss, it was the time after my father's death, and I was looking at the ground, as you do when you are mourning or otherwise low. You look low and your eyes are cast downwards. And I found these really soft places to land in the mosses, these beautiful cushions. We talk about moss cushions, so they grow in groups, in cushions or hummocks. So we get these pillows that you can perhaps put your head down onto if you're so inclined. But structurally, colourfully, visually, texturally, they are just beautiful, soft places to land. And they do a lot in their own right. So aside from my own connection to them, mosses do a lot very simply. So they're very simply structured. I mentioned they're not flowering species. They don't have roots. They're rootless. And yet they achieve a lot. So they provide homes for invertebrates. They store water, they filter the air, take out toxins. So they're doing a lot, although we don't often take very much notice of them.
Incredible, yeah. And when you kind of started to explore mosses, did you know much about them before you started to look down?
Not really. So I've always enjoyed mosses and found them fascinating, and so I knew a few. But not to the extent that I got to know them through the research for the book.
And yeah, let's talk about some of that research then, because obviously you're a poet. So what was your process of kind of pulling together the research around mosses? And because this is, although it is a book full of poetry and prose, you know, we have that science interwoven throughout. So yeah, what was that process like for you?
Yeah, I quite often work between disciplines. So Anybody who was in the previous talk, the birdsplaining talk, will have heard the talk about the field guides, which was really interesting to me, and to talk about the way that science has weaved its way through this particular book. So I conceived of it as a field guide, a poet's field guide for mosses. So what would that look like if a poet wrote a field guide? And what do we expect or hope from field guides? And quite often it is a drive towards identification. So we see a plant, we see a moss, and it's a natural instinct to want to know what it is. So what is this species? But a poet might come to that and think about all sorts of other things, might think about the research into mosses, so their uses, it's sort of in tradition. Mosses have lived very closely to humans for a long time and yet not really been that much spoken about or researched. So you may know that sphagnum mosses were used in wound dressing during the war for that cushioning, absorbent quality I mentioned. So you're not going to get to know about that through a field guide that is just describing what a moss looks like, where you might find it, things that drive towards identification. But through a poem, you can do a bit more. So you can still have those characteristics that might help you to identify a moss, but you can also bring in that kind of historical context, different uses of mosses. Mosses have also been used by women in interesting ways. So lining babies' nappies for sanitary products. Again, that kind of absorbent, soft, cushioning quality of mosses. So some of that knowledge works its way into poetry. But also I was interested in the idea of what if you don't have that kind of scientific field guide out with you when you're looking at mosses, but you have a poem. How does that change your interaction with the plant? And I'm kind of quite interested in that interaction, that exchange that goes on between people and plants. And I think, poetry is a way to start thinking about that.
And actually, how did the process of developing these poems and kind of pulling this together, how did that change your interaction with mosses and kind of being outdoors?
I don't think it was changing anything for me, but it might do for readers, I don't know. But so for me, it was expressing what I do when I interact with a moss. And so in the writing process, it was long periods of spending times in specific places, repeatedly visiting different mosses and noting down different qualities of them. So there's that site-specific experience of being with plants combined with the research into, the way that they live and this very different form of being, and thinking about things that exchange between the human and between the plant.
And much of this book is an adventure in its own right. We see you kind of travelling across the UK. And so how did you kind of come to develop this idea that you were going to see some of these unseen places? Where did you find out about these sites? And what was your journey with that?
Yeah, it's both a journey and an anti-journey, actually, the book. So one of the things I love about mosses is that you don't have to go on a big trek or adventure to find them. They are everywhere. So there'll be one out on the street as soon as you step outside. They will probably be on the floor, on the mat, growing on the mat. They are on your garage roof. They are everywhere. And so you can live in a city and have ready access to mosses. Equally, they grow freely in woodlands or in bogs, and that's where you will get a real expanse of mosses. But you don't need that big adventure, although there are different adventures in the book. There's also that kind of just everyday, on your doorstep, literally underneath your feet. You don't need to go very far to find mosses. And
what were some of the biggest revelations to you as you were kind of exploring the mosses around you? Talk to us a little bit about that.
I mean, I don't know about revelations because I think that it's a very quiet small exchange that happens with mosses, but that's not to mean it's any less significant. And I think if we can all have small, quiet relationships and exchanges with the natural world, that's all to the good, and it as part of our everyday life. And so we don't necessarily need to go on a big, heroic journey. We can just build these little moments into our day.
That's amazing, yeah. I think for me, one of the areas that I found really sort of, I guess, resonated with me was at Trosfyneth, which is a place kind of relatively close to where I live. And I've visited a huge amount of times, and I'd never experienced I'd never seen it through the eyes that you kind of presented to us with, you know, the mosses, and kind of you talk about following the golden glow. And so, yeah, being able to go back to these places that, you know, I was familiar with. Birmingham was another one where, you know, to be able to go and find the mosses in those areas. In terms of, you know, the fact that you can find the mosses in the cities and in the more rural areas, what was your experience of the two? Was there kind of, did you prefer one or the other? Was there a difference in the types of moss? I mean, I'm sure there was, but yeah.
Yeah, it's nice to do both. So it's nice to have friends, if I can talk about mosses in that way. But your neighbours, certainly, I think being neighbourly is a way that we can talk about plants and our relationship to them. And so it's good to have that relationship with plants that you see again and again and are very local to you and that you know well. And also it's tremendously exciting when you come across one that you don't see very often, that perhaps it's the first time that you've seen it. And also, I don't know how many moss people we have here, so people who are used to identifying moss. Does anybody would call themselves somebody who IDs moss?
Amazing.
One in the room, so that it shows my point. I think it's not really the one that we look to analyse and spend a lot of time with, but it's quite hard, isn't it? They're quite difficult species.
You need a hand lens.
Yes, you do, and you have to go into a lot of detail, don't you, to tell the difference. So in that respect, it's not that accessible. That kind of rush to identification is difficult, and I use that word rush, but nothing about mosses is fast. They are slow growing, they are slow evolving, although they beat us to coming out of the water onto land, so in some ways they are fast. But identifying a moss is a slow process, so yes, with the hand lens, and it's minute details, so it's seeing what the different leaf shape is, seeing how the different leaf edge is, or it could be the hair on the leaf tip. It's those fine details which actually give you a good sense of achievement and sort of coming to know something very intimately in a way that we don't do, for example, when we look at trees, and we can quite readily see the difference there. But when you have to kind of get down on your hands and knees, get the lens out and pass out those minute details, it takes a long time, and you do sort of have a different kind of relation and intimacy with the plants. And so I enjoy both the plants that I see readily and I can identify very easily, but also the ones that are rarer and in the more far-flung places that it takes much longer to identify.
Yeah. And the book is called 12 Words for Moss, so a big part of this is you kind of retelling the story of moss and kind of changing the language around it in terms of their names. And what was that process like for you, kind of, experiencing the mosses, writing this poetry, and then, changing their names?
So it's all part of that relation, I think. So when we come to know something or somebody or some being, I think naming is part of that. We all have names for each other, and we have pet names, and those are really the names that I'm talking about. So I'm not changing the binomials or anything like that. I'm not contesting the names of the mosses, but I am offering up my pet names and the names that come through my associations with the mosses, and I'm not prescribing them. So I'm not saying these are the names that I think you should use. I think you'll come to have your own names, perhaps, for mosses if you spend time with them. And I think Robin Wall Kimmerer has written a book called Gathering Moss, and in that she says, It's about, she feels that her task is talking about the names that mosses might have for themselves. And I think that's an interesting question. So it's not about kind of rushing to that identification or that knowledge. It's about thinking about what other processes are involved in naming, who is doing the naming, what is that naming achieving, and appreciating the fact that mosses may well have names for themselves that we cannot quite access.
That's a really beautiful way of thinking about it. And I suppose tenuously linked is Nan Shepherd kind of sort of said similar things about the mountains in terms of, you have to really experience them and kind of live through them before you're able to kind of talk about them. Would you like to read any?
Yeah, I was thinking it's probably about time I read something. So we'll read Glowflake. So you're talking about neighbourly mosses versus the more remote mosses, but Glowflake is one you may well have on your doorstep, and particularly if you have a garden, so around trees, in grass, and it's Thuidium tamaracenum, for the one person that might know what that means, common tamarisk moss, but yeah, Glowflake to me. O love, O leaping heart, O stag, O Pythagoras, O to believe your light is my light as if you weren't lit without me. O hoof, O bicycle, O bell, O travelling sailor flung from one port to another, O drop, O rain, O Wellington boot, on fennel, puddle, pedal across terrain, O to be four again. Imagine living next to somebody every day and to actively like them and yet not know them. So when they arrive at your door, fully grown and more intimate than a bone, is it politeness you practice or do you run ecstatic through your repertoire of dances? O furry antler branches, come in. Let me only now begin to respond to the thing we named you. Common, O musical box, O foxglove, O elfin chicken wire, O downy choir, O quiet symphony, living with you is a luxury. O sugar mouse, O leafy flounce, O forest fleece, I apologize for the breach in naming. So let us begin again, old friend. Please, let me use my words that only come out at parties. Hummingbird, hawk moth, hill fluff, hedge heart, O flickering filament, O chlorophylled cinnamon, speckled shaman of the grass, I haven't come close. I don't like to impose. The lens is still in its case, O heathery lace, O field charm, O glowflake, O lemon face. Shall we go now to the place you always take me? To the soft quilt of ferny lilt, the place your name always conjures.
Oh, just clap. I have to say, I get to read a lot of the books for Kendal Mountain Festival, and this was by far my absolute favourite book. The fact that you have these poems, and all of them so different, and all of them, you read them out loud as you read them in your head, and just to hear you as well, you take so much more from them every time you read, and I'm very passionate about this book. I'm really fascinated about the process of poetry creation, and I'd love to know more about kind of how you really begin to transform these mosses into these words, and what that looks like.
So each moss presents something different, and I don't go with a prescribed sense of what I'm going to do or how I'm going to write. So Glowflake, obviously, it's the light, and that's something we haven't mentioned yet, but light is really important in this book, and every chapter is named after a form of light and a form of the light through the mosses. So we have Glowflake starting off. And when you look at moss, it does something very interesting with water. When it's rained on, when it soaks up moss, it completely changes. It becomes a different kind of being and flooded with light. So it can be quite dull looking, in natural light, but when it's rained on, when it takes on this water, it becomes something else. And so that's sort of what I was touching in Glowflake, and the fact that this is going on every day around us, not bothering about us, but this kind of daily miracle is going on, and this light exchange is taking place, whether we see it or not. And so that is what went into Glowflake, talking about the qualities of light, different theories of light got in there, as well as the textures and the visual side of being with moss, and then sort of trying to come up with different combinations of words that would give that kind of quality. So that was in Glowflake, but each poem equally does something different. And they are interspersed through the book, sort of in the way that if you were on a journey and you were looking and you came across the moss, and you would take out your field guide to look at it. In the book, I have a prose narrative that runs through where I'm sort of visiting these mosses, but also, showing the research into mosses. And then there'll be a poem when I find that moss. So there's a poem rather than the identification. And so in the reading process, I hope to give that kind of quality of sort of, stumbling upon a moss, there's a moss. And what do I see about that? Okay, in this one, it's the light and it's the glowing, it's the quality of light through the moss. But different poems will draw on different qualities of the moss.
Amazing. And did any of the mosses give you trouble in terms of kind of turning them into poems? Were there any parts that you kind of you really couldn't get to the essence of it?
No.
Oh, amazing. That's
because mosses are great. I'm just a fangirl for moss. What can I say? No, but I suppose I wouldn't write about it if I didn't feel closely connected to it. So as I said, I wasn't prescriptive about it. I wasn't going to write about that moss. I was going, and then whatever presented itself to me, I would write about. So no, I find them all fascinating, and in different seasons, in different quantities of water that they've taken on, in different weathers and sunlight and hail. There are some, talking about process, there are some songs in the book, and I might at some point find where I talk about that and read that when I find that. But not all the interactions led to poems. So, where poetry becomes song is another question. But some were actually quite clearly songs and were telling me that they were songs. So I'll found it now, so I'll read a little bit about that process. I tread softly from moss mound to mound, finding the same plants whose heat I had touched a year ago, whose warmth had lit me as I had let grief go. Now I am not touching, but listening, bending my ear right down and waiting. My human ears, untuned to moss, cannot hear anything at first. It takes time to cleanse the palate of the air from human concerns, to filter through to moss. After several minutes crouched awkwardly in the cold, I begin to hear the air make its way through the plants. The longer I stay, the louder it becomes. In time, it feels astonishing that I hadn't heard it before. As I listen to the mosses, each group of gathered plants seems to offer a different part of the tune. The mosses on the trees and cave walls produce a high note. The mosses on the boulders, on the ground, a low reply. I begin to lend my voice to theirs, a high ah from the treetops, a low oh from the floor. In the mouth of the cave, white bones form a stave. I write down each sound. Ah, oh, oh, ah. Paying close attention as words take the place of these incremental sounds. Ah becomes I, oh becomes no. A long sequence of ohs forms sorrow. These sounds, together with the whip of the wind and the sting of the ice, which begins to fall as hail, feel something like a singing sorrow. And from the high branches of the beech, I sing as the hail falls in. Ah, oh, I know. Sweeping down the ridge. Oh, your sorrow, tripping among the boulders, la 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 la, in the hill. The enclosure fills with reverberating trills in a song that is open to anyone. The wind plays its part through the mosses whose dance directs its course as the hail bursts forth and the clatter of bark and the heave of the dark and the beating of wings and the pouring of the things that have been dormant starts. I know your sorrow. I'll leave it there because I'm also doing an event this evening that some of you may be coming to, and I don't want to repeat myself. But then it sort of leads into a song about hail, which you can download. It's out there in the world, and I got to work with the harpist, Georgia Ruth, the Welsh harpist, who did some really lovely work interacting with that as well, and we were really thinking about that sound of the water through the mosses. So in that particular one, it was hail, but there were also different moments experienced with the moss. So there's deep listening as well as looking that go into the poems or the songs. And yes, so these were the ones that are captured in the book.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely incredible. And I mean, being able to kind of transform some of these into actual music that you're able to put out there must have been such an incredible process to go through. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to that event this evening as well. I'm going to touch on one of the themes, and we've talked a lot about moss, and obviously we can't not have a conversation about moss, but that you mentioned there, which is about sorrow and about grief. And obviously a lot of this book is about the kind of aftermath of your father's death, but it's interspersed and it's woven through. And so how did kind of exploring moss help you move through that grief process? Or, you know, how did that happen, I suppose?
So initially, I mentioned I was looking down through that mourning period and found all these wonderful, miraculous, small, miniature worlds, rainforests on a miniature scale, which is an accurate way of describing them. So in that sense, they were these soft cushions. And then when I looked more closely through a hand lens, also through a microscope, so I took slides. At the beginning, I took a few slides, and by the end, I really found that I couldn't even take a scalpel to a moss leaf. You know, how am I breaking apart these plants that have come to mean so much to me? But I did initially take a few slides and look at sphagnum moss leaves and see the structure of them. And sphagnum moss is really interesting. So it forms peat. It's one of the plants that decompose and form peat in peatlands. So it's partly dead and partly alive. And when you look at that on a cellular level, you can actually see the living cells surrounded by dead cells. And when you look at that, it looks like chainmail. So it's this kind of very interlinked, sparse, but actually quite beautiful, silvery structure. And that is a really interesting way of thinking about grief and life and death. That actually you can be alive, you can be a living sphagnum plant, but still have your dead cells carried with you and interlocked with the living cells. So that was a nice thing to think about, because I think we are encouraged to move on very quickly after a loss, and it's seen as something negative to dwell on something like bereavement. But I think actually you can carry those losses with you, and it doesn't mean that you stay forever in that place, but it can be linked to everything else. It can be linked to life, it can be linked to joy, but you can carry them with you. And that cellular structure of the sphagnum moss leaf really suggested that to me. And so the epigraph in the Moss book is from Ode to Joy. the lyrics put to Beethoven's movement, which is a circling melody. It repeats. And of course, grief is cyclical. And so in the Moss book, there are all kinds of repeating refrains to give both that structure of the moss, but also to give a way through grief, that kind of cycle. And it's enacted in many ways in the book, but one kind of quite obvious feature is that the last sentence of every chapter is the first sentence of the next chapter. So we have that hand-in-glove connecting repetition that really mirrors that chainmail of the moss and gives, hopefully, the reader an experience of moss. And then just sonically, every last line of every section in the book rhymes with the one that follows. So you're not probably going to pick up on that in any conscious level, but it has a kind of internal music to the book, and I was really thinking about that ode to joy and that cycling, circling way that we can return to joy, and it can be an invitation. So what I like about that epigraph too is it says, "Let us sing more joyful tunes." So it's giving us permission, but it's also an invitation. And I think sometimes, we need to give ourselves that invitation. If joy is not readily available to us, it's a conscious thing. Let us. Today I'm going to find that joy. And so there's that orientation always towards joy through the book. And it comes in these cycling motifs and in the poems that just drop themselves in, not necessarily where you're expecting to find them, as those daily little microscopic doses of joy hopefully find us too, when we're looking and when we're open.
Wow, yeah. I had a whole question on that epigraph, so I'm really grateful that you just brought that up. I suppose, I read The Grassling, and obviously there's a lot about your father in there, who's obviously a keen gardener and really into landscape as well. So this feels a really lovely way to kind of tie the two books together. Was there an energy between the two, do you think, the two books?
Yes, there was. So The Grassling was very much about soil, so it was still looking at that boundary layer, but much more closely linked to a particular set of fields in Devon and my family history on my father's side, a kind of farming relationship to the fields over centuries. And when he is gone, so that's kind of that last link in that chain and that relationship with the land, what does that mean? So that was really explored in The Grassling. And there were some quite visceral passages on grief in that book. And here we're much softer. We've sort of come to a point a little bit later. So it's more about what comes after and that sort of long period. So I think sometimes, as I mentioned, we're encouraged to get up and get on with it. And this book is really about taking your time. And it's okay to be slow and come to things in your own time. So yeah, this very much is the aftermath.
The aftermath, yeah. And I have a question that actually comes from a friend who I had lunch with, who really enjoyed The Grassling, also enjoyed Swims, which was your first book. That was correct. That one was your first book, wasn't it?
Swims was my first creative book, but I write critically as well.
Yes.
So yeah.
Sorry. And her question was really about, she's obviously read this book, and she sort of said, we start to see glimpses of your mother and her life in Kenya, and how was her question was really about how was the experience of talking to her about mosses and kind of, from having such a different cultural outlook, I guess.
Yeah, it's only a very small moment in the book where I mention my mother's connection to land also, but I'm afraid my mum is more in the camp of mosses are things to be weeded and taken out of the lawn. So I find you kind of naturally fall into one of two camps. So the kind of moss, let's rake that up, let's get that out of the disturblum, which my mother falls into, I'm afraid. Or the others who, when you say, I'm writing about moss, are like, oh, yes, moss. Yes. So, I mean, I can say that as a result of the book, actually, my mother now says that she has a respect for moss. So I count that as a win. She doesn't go as far as to say she's going to stop removing it from her lawn. But yes, so my mother's history is just touched on a little bit in the book.
And actually interesting that removal is fascinating to me anyway, because there's a very small section kind of towards the end where you actually talk about the trimming and the removal of things and how that's kind of, I've got it written down somewhere. So yeah, you talk about the cutting away as a form of tending, so removing, and that I really wanted to ask about kind of the editing of your own work and the kind of, yeah, I mean, you said previously as well that you got to a point where you didn't even want to take a scalpel to the mosses. So yeah, how that's a very unformed question, I apologise. Sorry. Yeah, so about that process of kind of like cutting back and weeding away, and both for the mosses and your own writing. Yeah.
Well, it's a hybrid book, so there are lots of different modes going on in the book. I think poetry itself is it's very succinct. It's like a shot of language. So that is very much condensed. And then you have that in the slower, I think, sentence-based work of the prose, in which it's encompassed. And they were just very different modes. So I actually wrote the poems, seeing that as one body of work, and then dropped them into the prose where I encountered the mosses in the prose. So they were two very different kinds of writing, with the poetry almost sort of editing itself and being this very condensed form, and slotted in to the prose work.
Thank you. And I suppose one of the questions that we touched on it earlier, and I probably should have brought this question up then, but at one point you sort of say, what can we share, the scientists and the poets, between us? And I wondered, have you found an answer to that question in this at all? Or is this book basically an answer to that question?
Yeah, in a way, it's sort of enacting the question.
Yeah.
So it's got scientific modes and research in there. It's got poetry. It's got prose narratives. It's got a beginning and an end, and things that happen in between, and then the poetry that takes place in a different time scale altogether. So in a way, it's one answer. I think working collaboratively, I think most of us would agree, is the most effective way to work. So whether that's between disciplines, so science and arts, or between different communities, different interest groups, that's the way to achieve more and achieve better. But I think that quote about the scientists and the poets came in Cumbria, came at Roudsey. So I'd been looking at Bolton Fell and Roudsey Woods. And there it was very much a question of different methodologies. So in the book I go on lots of different mossing trips, and sometimes with scientists, sometimes with friends who are scientists. And I'm often left behind, and the scientists are off on their mission to answer their question, and I'm left behind. And they'll come and they'll say, what are you doing? What are you looking for? What's the question? What is it that you're trying to test or find out? And I have no idea in that early stage. I mean, in a rough, sketchy way, I could frame some questions, but it's not about that. It's about that openness and the interaction and what happens in those moments, as I talked about at the beginning, those plant-human exchanges, and not coming with the hope that this is going to be my conclusion, but coming much more openly and seeing what suggests itself. So there are some just very long periods when I'm out with the mosses of seemingly not doing very much, but it's kind of a filtering process, and it's something that takes time. So when you build exchanges with people, it happens over time, right? It's repeated interactions and exchanges, and you don't necessarily know at the outset what's going to be the conclusion, what's going to come of it. So that was one of the tensions that I talked about in the book, that it's just interesting to work with different methodologies, but it can be challenging too.
Yeah. And you say you spent a lot of time not doing much, but you also spent a lot of time swimming in the moss. That was such an interesting depiction for me. And had you, okay, just talk to us about that, because I always found that really fascinating, about how you were able to do that and also experience moss in that way. That's not a way that many of us experience moss.
I'll perhaps read that a little bit from Roudsey Woods, because I think this was one of my early moments. So I go in the book from just dipping the finger into the water to full immersion and swimming. Perhaps I'll just read. Yeah, so I'm talking about that frustration in methodologies and the fact that I'm so slow and these other people are rushing towards their conclusions. So I say, I straggle at the back, waiting for a chance to dip my fingers into the sunny bog water undetected. I don't know what I'm looking for, only that it takes silence and listening to respond to the glistening. And when the time comes, it's thrilling. There is something exhilarating about the orange-coloured water, its unexpected heat as I dangle my fingers through. Brushed with moss, my skin basks in the liquid sun. Seeing moss not chiefly as something to observe, but as being a collection of beings that you might come somehow, and however incompletely to know, means there is a deep joy in drawing close. Even without knowledge of their processes, it is enlivening to come up against their edges, to feel the brush of their branches, the glow of their leaves, the pull of their rhythms and sparkling wreaths. Yet, when you know too how they are keeping carbon from entering the atmosphere as a harmful greenhouse gas, the connection comes deeper, more integral than that. It is something like homage, or the keeping of a promise. In goes the whole hand, the wrist, a stretch of the arm. But soon I will be missed and must return to the group. I pull up reluctantly, shake myself loose.
Just so beautiful. I wanted to ask one final question just before we go to the Q&A. And it was the question that I asked you just before this session, and which was, how long did it take you to kind of pull all this together? And how long did it take overall for you to do this?
Probably about 6 years.
Wow.
So when I talk about being slow, I am quite slow, yes, in terms of the early research, so that, when you're working across modes, obviously I'm researching that scientific thread and the historical, cultural context of moss, and then the poetry, and then my own experience through the mosses. So there are so many threads, and they accumulate in the way that perhaps peat accumulates and has layers. We have that sense of different layers, then compacting together, and then you get the book. But there is all kinds of different threads that you research over time that go into it. And speaking about water, I'll end with a poem. Perhaps it's very short, but this is Ophelia. Sphagnum cuspidatum, feathery bog moss. So if you go to a bog, this is one you'll see really regularly. It's got different names that aren't entirely flattering, like dead kittens. So it's not really treated perhaps with the respect that it might deserve. But to me, it's Ophelia. Submerged, you search for the hidden path, for the brace of stars that would steer you right. You can't see what I see, how you ignite the dark, that those searching for light might themselves be sparks. What if Ophelia had simply got out the water? I see her everywhere, entering rooms at night with her leaves tipped white, in despair of the care she needs, unaware of the trail she leaves.
Oh my God. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to open up the floor now to questions. Please ask as many as you have. We've got about 15 minutes to kind of have that before the signing. So please, anyone have a question that they would like to ask? It's always really awkward in the town hall. No one ever puts their hand up first. There we go, thank you.
I hope that I've always been that sort of person. So I've talked about being slow, and I am quite slow and measured in my response to life. So I think perhaps moss helped and complemented that. I wouldn't say it was a complete revelation because that's how I am orientated towards life anyway. But I hope that you might get a sense of that piece, certainly from reading about the mosses, but also just being with them, because there is that sense of quietness, and partly it's that cushioning quality that they have with sound. They sort of pull it all in, but it does give you that sense of peace and quiet, and everything slows and stills around the mosses. They quite often grow on gravestones, of course, which is quite fitting for them too.
Any more questions? Yes.
I just want to say thank you, because it just made me, now when I go out, I'm going to look at mosses.
Brilliant.
Take them for granted.
Brilliant.
Enjoying them on walks at certain year. I love the way that they grow in walls.
Yes.
Dead trees and things like that. And they are fascinating, and knowing about the healing properties of them.
Yes.
But thank you. I just thought,
Brilliant. My job is done, that you're going to look for the mosses. And I think, yes, just pausing and stopping when you see one, and seeing what happens when you do.
Thank you. That was delightful. And often when I'm out walking, I don't know much about mosses, but I do enjoy them. And you often bunch mosses and lichens
Yes.
together, as if you're looking in your
Yeah.
field guide. But from what you said today, I couldn't see any bunching together, that you were really talking about mosses. And these lichens, which grow along, often on dry, inhospitable rocks. So I just found that quite interesting.
Yeah, they are often lumped together. Liverworts too, of course, but different species, and so why not put the attention on the mosses? And we might talk about peatlands quite a lot too, and rightly so, but not coming down to that, singular focus on the moss. And so that's quite often what I do in my writing, is hone in on something that otherwise goes unnoticed and isn't quite as sung as it should be. So yes, it was very much mosses taking up the space and having the spotlight.
Yeah, I can imagine if you spent the next 6 years looking at lichens, the music around what you wrote and the words would be just totally different. But in my books, they're often there they are.
Yes. Well, what a wonderful future that would be for me, the next 6 years, looking at lichens. Sadly not, but...
Yes.
I'm intrigued with how the science and the art have come together, and I feel a lot of scientific breakthrough comes from creative thought. And as an artist, do you think you became more scientific as you
Yes, I was certainly drawing on different forms of scientific knowledge and inquiry, different methods, looking at the field guide as a form, looking at identification, but I was also doing things that are very different to that. So I was also looking at it artistically, looking at the personal responses to mosses. So I don't know that I've become more scientific, but I have encompassed some of that attention and those modes of inquiry alongside. So it's more a bringing together of, rather than saying one has supremacy over the other. It's how they work together.
I don't feel like I've done nothing noteworthy in my life, but I did English literature and I was kind of in the arts, and then I decided to completely deviate and I went into the sciences. And so I, in a similar sort of way, now work quite interdisciplinary. And I've always felt like the two, just to have both of those angles just allows you to see so much more. Yeah. And I think there's a really beautiful mesh of the two. You can see beauty and art and poetry in science in and of itself. And yeah, anyway.
Can I ask a very quick practical question? Is there anywhere online where we can hear you read your poetry? It was so beautiful. I just wanted to not lose that.
There are sections from the Grassling that are available online through Penguin. I don't think there is for 12 words, so there's no audiobook yet, although it has been spoken of. And there are, of course, the songs, so there's The Moss and the Hail, which you can download from Spotify.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I was just thinking about kind of common names and plant lore, and I wondered if you felt yourself as part of the lineage of how knowledge about plants is passed between cultural heritage. And I wondered if you had any sense through your research in terms of how much still exists in terms of all the common names for mosses, whether you felt that so much had been lost, or whether you found little kind of tendrils of cultural knowledge through song or from poems in the past. And yeah, if you had a general sense of whether we're coming closer culturally towards mosses, or whether we're, have now got a 100-year gap to kind of come closer to any impressions.
Yes, so I have come across some common names for moss, but not as many, and I think it's not been researched as much. But among older generations, there is still a currency of common names for moss, but often grouped together, so not specifically on a species level, but different mosses, like we would call aquacarps, so the ones that point upwards and look like stars. So quite often people say, oh, that's star moss, and that's not actually the specific species. It's just that, the kind of different kinds and groups of mosses that look like stars. So I have come across a few of those indigenous terms for mosses. But yeah, we just haven't had the same kind of attention, or it hasn't been recorded. And so it's very difficult to come across that, certainly not in archival methods of research. But through speaking to people, some of that has surfaced. So I think you're right. I think perhaps there is a gap. But at the moment, there's happily a bit more of a focus on mosses. Quite a few people are looking more closely at mosses now as part mostly of wider research into peatlands, because I think we're aware now of how valuable they are, and a lot of projects, regeneration projects with the arts and sciences, are looking at peatlands, and as part of that, they're looking at mosses. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions? I had one final question just for our moss person. How did you find that?
Personally, I'm probably more, I come at it from a geographical point of view. I love the looking at the plant how mosses are so indicative of habitat, which you find that they're really wonderful indicators of the healthy environment, an environment which is perhaps on sandstone, you get certain mosses growing, on limestone you get totally different mosses. They just shout at you about the sort of place you're actually walking through.
Yeah, that's a really nice point. And as you get to notice them, there's that familiarity, isn't there? And you see them and you think, oh yes, I'm in that kind of habitat and I've found this moss that I know. Yeah.
Do you have any, perhaps one or two favourites that you recommend people look out for?
Yeah, so I always feel bad about, it's like your children, yeah, this is my favourite. But Glowflake is one of my favourites, so Theridium tamaracenum. It is quite common, but more in woodlands, grassy areas. And when you're starting to ID mosses, perhaps a few of you might start doing that, it's one of them that you will recognise because it looks a bit different to the others. It's got very feathery kinds of leaves, so you can tell it apart. It's a bit distinctive. I think when you're first coming to look at mosses, the ones that are a bit distinctive are good because you can think, okay, I know what that one is, and that helps you in the beginning. The sphagnum mosses I love, you know, not necessarily the rare ones, the exotic ones, but just ones that capture the light in a really interesting way. There's a moss I call ginger spice, which is Sphagnum fuscum, which I first saw in Cumbria, which is a really nice gingery one.
Amazing. Sorry for putting you on the spot. Okay, I think that's the end, and we're going to have a signing at the back. So, yeah, if you'll just join me in thanking Elizabeth-Jane again.